Hello everyone, this is a step-by-step tutorial video on using AWS AppConfig in the AWS console. And this video is going to consist of 3 different sections. First, I'm going to show you how to set up AWS AppConfig in the console, including creating an application, an environment, a configuration profile, and just setting up some initial config. Next, I'm going to show you how to use the rollback alarm feature, and that's going to allow us to set up and configure an alarm that's attached to our environment so that anytime we do a deployment, if that alarm fires, it's going to automatically roll back that deployment to the previous working configuration. In the third section, I'm going to show you how to set up AppConfig with AWS Lambda using Python, and we're going to be using the AppConfig extensions feature that makes it much easier to interact with AppConfig using a Lambda function. So that's what we're going to do in this video. I'll see you in the AWS console. Hello everyone, here we are in the AWS console. So in order to get started with AppConfig, we're going to navigate over to it in the top search box here. So we're just going to type in AppConfig and we're going to click on that and it's going to bring us to the console page for AppConfig. All right, so here is the home page, and first of all, we need to create an AppConfig application. Application is just a container for your environment and for your configuration profiles. It's just an organizational structure that you can use. So to get started, let's go to create application here. We're going to give our application a name. So we're going to call this my app in this case, or you can name this whatever you wish. There are some options to be aware of here. So if you want to associate certain extensions with your AppConfig application, you can. And if you take a look at this, there's extensions that you can choose here. And there's an AppConfig deployment events to EventBridge, to SQS, and SNS. What this basically means is that anytime you do a configuration deployment update with your AppConfig application, it's going to automatically trigger events to EventBridge, SQS, or SNS. This is great if you want to get notified when these config updates are happening, if you have any kind of use case where you need to respond to them. We're not going to be doing that in this case because we have no need for it, but it may be useful for some of you. All right, so let's go to create application now, and we're pretty much good to go, and we're ready to get started creating our config. So I want to start with creating our environment, and the environment is just a logical deployment group that you're going to be deploying your configuration profiles to. So let's go ahead and do that first. So we're going to click on environments here, and we're going to create a new environment. So I'm just going to call this one, you can call this whatever you want, like a test or a beta or a prod environment. I'm just going to call mine beta. And then there are monitors that you can associate with your environment. And these monitors require a IEM role and a CloudWatch alarm. And these are used during the deployment process. So if any alarm fires while you're doing a new configuration deployment, AppConfig is automatically going to get notified and trigger a rollback of your deployment whenever that alarm fires. We're not going to do this right away. I'm going to come back to this after I set everything up and show you how you can incorporate a rollback alarm monitor into your AppConfig setup. So I'm just going to minimize that. There's extensions here again if you want to do it at an environment level or an application level. It's up to you. We're pretty much good to go now to create our environment. So I'm going to click that. All right, so this is where you're going to be monitoring your environment deployments. So you can see like we have no monitors here yet. We have no deployments yet because we haven't deployed any of our configuration yet. In fact, that is the next thing that we want to do. So we want to go back to our app that we just created under my app. And now I'm going to switch gears to configuration profiles and feature flags. And now, as we mentioned, configuration profiles are kind of the containers for your config, whether that be JSON, YAML, or just plain text that you want to store in AppConfig. We're going to be using JSON in this tutorial, but you can also use those other ones as well. So after clicking on that, we're going to go to create here. And this is going to ask us what type of configuration profile would we like to create. Would you like to create a feature flag or would you like to create a freeform configuration? I'm going to use the freeform configuration because I think that it allows you to do a lot more and be a lot more flexible. And I find that it's a lot more applicable for the most of you that are going to be using AppConfig in general. So let's click on that radio box there and we're going to click on select now. And now it's going to ask us for a bunch of different configuration settings for our profile. So the first thing we need to do is specify a name for our configuration profile. So I'm going to call this the customer IDs configuration profile. And this is going to store us, actually, you know what, let's just add allow list here to indicate that these customer IDs are going to be in our allow list for our application. And then we need to specify the configuration source. Now, AppConfig is kind of interesting. You can host your configuration within AppConfig itself. You can also host it within an external source, such as Amazon S3, Systems Manager Parameter, or Code Pipeline. If you add any of these, you're going to need to reference the corresponding details for each specific source. So for S3, we need to provide the location of the object that we want to use for our configuration. Same thing for any of these other ones. The configuration is slightly different depending on what you select. Using the AWS AppConfig hosted configuration is by far the most simple, so that's what we're going to be using for this demonstration. All right, so since we selected that, now we need to specify our content. So like I said, you can specify text, JSON, or YAML. I'm going to just drop in a very simple JSON file that I prepared previously, and this just contains some customer IDs that are going to be part of our allow list for this configuration profile. So our object has a key called customer IDs, and then we have 1, 2, and 3 in here. So these are the IDs that are allowed on our allow list. One minor correction here, I seem to forgot to have selected the JSON type and I left it as text, even though the input file is JSON. I would have expected this to throw some type of error either now or through the JSON validation process, but this seemed to work fine. Just something to be aware of. All right, so you don't need to do anything else for this. You can put a description in if you wish, but that's optional. We're gonna go ahead and click on Next now. And this is asking us for different validators that we want to apply to ensure that we don't accidentally introduce any syntactically incorrect configuration updates to our AppConfig profile. Now you can either do this by using a JSON schema, which is you kind of write like a template file that specifies what the structure of your AppConfig profile looks like, or you can do it in an AWS Lambda function where as a validation step, AppConfig will invoke your Lambda. Your Lambda can do some custom logic to ensure the update is valid and then return a successful response, and then AppConfig will proceed. JSON schema is what we're going to be going for in this demo, and I'll show you kind of what this process looks like. So it's asking us for a JSON schema file here, and there's a lot that you can do with JSON schema, and I'm just going to drop in a piece of code here that I've already prepared that shows you how to enforce the customer IDs array list that we put in for our structure. Bear with me for a sec. I'm just going to grab this. Okay, there we go. All right, so just pasted that in really quick. So this is what the JSON schema file looks like. So let's just walk through this really quick. You can ignore most of it. Type object, that's because our input file is a JSON object. We have some properties. Our property is customer IDs. Remember, that is the key that we put in our config update. And you can put in different types. So you can ensure that this is an array. It can be an integer. It could be a list, any other types that are supported. You can also put in whether or not certain fields are required. So I put in customer IDs, which basically indicates that customer IDs is mandatory. Now, if you put in a field here under required and you don't provide that value in your configuration update, your deployment is going to fail right away. It's not even going to go to the first step. It's just going to fail the validation and tell you to go and fix your error. So this is very, very handy to use to validate your config so you don't get any errors into your config update. All right, so we're pretty much good to go here. Let's scroll down and we're going to go to Create Configuration Profile. All right, so our configuration profile is created. We have this initial step here, so 1, 2, and 3. You can also change this. You can see there's different versions that are available. So we're on version 1 right now. I can just add an additional customer ID in here. Actually, oops, you need to go to Create first to create a new one. And let's just add a new one here. And let's just add 4 and then create that hosted version. And now you should see there's version 2 and this has the 4 in it. And if we go back here, you can see the previous versions. So this is what I was referring to as the audit trail for your configuration profile. So you can see all the changes over time. Very handy just for transparency in your config updates. All right, so now we are pretty much good to go. If we go back to the home page for our app, we should see, yep, we have our customer IDs allow list. We also have an environment now, which is our beta environment. And what we can do is we can go into this environment and start a deployment. So let's do that now. We're going to click on beta. And in the top right here, we're going to go to Start Deployment. And this is going to prompt us for a couple options. So let's click on that. And it's asking us what configuration do we want to deploy? Obviously the one we just created, or you can create a brand new one from here. What version do you want to deploy? We do want to deploy the most recent one, so version 2. And now we need to specify a deployment strategy. Now these are the deployment strategies. I didn't create these. These are all automatically provided by AWS. Let's talk about them really quick, but do note that if you don't like any of these deployment strategies and they're not satisfactory, you can create your own with any of the custom settings that you want to provide. So the first one here is probably the most simple. It is just all now. So it's an instant deployment. So for any of your targets that are currently polling for configuration updates, it is immediately going to start returning the new update. So version 2 in this case. Then there is the all at once with a 10-minute bake time. So you can actually see here the settings. So it's 0 minutes deployment time for the first one, 0-minute bake time, 100% right away, growth type is linear. This next one is almost the same except that it has a bake time of 10 minutes. The next one is a little bit more progressive. So it's a deployment time of 1 minute. It's got another bake time of 1 minute. And it does 50% jumps or 50% steps every 30 seconds, right? So 50% divided by 1 minute is every 30 seconds, and the growth type is linear. Now this next one is a much slower and much safer deployment method. This is AWS recommended. They call this an AppConfig Canary 10% over 20 minutes. This will deploy over 20 minutes. There's a big time of 10 minutes. It's going to grow at 10% rates, but the growth type is exponential. So it'll go 10 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 80, and then all the way up to 100. So for us, since this is just a very quick demo, let's just do the all now one so I can show you what this looks like. And we're going to do start deployment. And you can see here, it's automatically at 100% right after I did this. So if you were to start calling the start configuration session and then get latest configuration APIs, you would immediately start getting version number 2 in your API call. All right, so that was a very trivial deployment. You'll probably won't be using this type of deployment in real life because it's kind of pretty dangerous. You're going from 0 to 100 right away. What you'll probably do is a slower deployment, and then you'll incorporate a monitor that can automatically detect for issues and roll back the deployment to a previous version if it detects any kind of errors. So I want to show you how to set that up because it is a little bit tricky, and I think it is very useful. So as you can see here right now, we don't have monitors that are attached to this environment that we're deploying to. So you can see no monitors exist for this environment. So we're going to change that. And I do have a alarm that I already set up, and it's just a kind of fake alarm. I called it the Lambda error alarm. It's not actually hooked up to my Lambda function. I'm just going to use it to attach it to our AppConfig setup. And then I'm going to manually put this into alarm state during the deployment, and you'll see how AppConfig responds to it. So just know that that's what I'm doing here, and there's no black magic going on. All right, so let's go ahead and set this up. So let's go back to AppConfig here, and we are going to go to our environment, which was beta in this case. Actually, really quick, I just noticed you can see here now there's the deployment history. So you can see over time, we did deployment number 1. Here was the name, here's the version, here's the state, and here is the timestamp. Just wanted to point that out. This is where all your deployment logs will show. But yeah, let's continue on updating our environment to incorporate this alarm here. So we're going to go to Update Environment. And now we're going to expand out the monitors section of the console. And so what it's asking for here is an IEM role and an alarm that we want to hook into. The alarm we've already created, that's our Lambda error alarm. However, there is an IEM role that you need to provide that has the correct permissions associated with it. It needs 2 permissions. It needs a policy, and that policy needs to allow it to call CloudWatch's Describe Alarms API. And then it also needs a trust relationship so that AppConfig is allowed to assume the IEM role. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to duplicate this tab, and we're going to go ahead and create that role with the right policy and with the right trust relationship so that we can provide it in that section of the console. So I'm going to go to IEM, and let's just go and create that policy and role really quick. So IEM, we're going to go to roles, and we're going to create a new role in the top right here. And we're going to do custom trust policy just so we don't have to look at any of this stuff. And I'm just going to drop in my trust relationship here. I'll make this available to you so you don't have to copy it out of the video, but it's a very, very simple trust policy. The only thing I changed from what I just copied and pasted in is under principal, we have a service, and that's appconfig.amazonaws.com, and the action that we are allowing is STS assume role. So that's the trust policy for this role. Let's go down now and click on next. We also need to provide it with a policy. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to create policy at the top here, and we can either do it through JSON or the visual editor. I'll just show you how to do it through here so you don't have to paste in a config file. So we're going to type in CloudWatch. Okay. And I believe it's under read. And yeah, there it is, describe alarm. So that's the permission that you need. And you can give it a specific resource name, so a specific alarm that you want to give permissions to. I'm going to give it to all resources here just as a quick little step. Then we're going to click on next and next again to review. Give this thing a name. So CW describe alarms is fine with me. And now we're going to go to create policy in the bottom right. And this may take a moment or so. All right, so the policy has been created. Just make sure that if we go back to the other tab really quick, we need to attach it. So I'm going to refresh, and CW something something is what I called it. There it is. Oh, I misspelled that. Awesome. So we're going to click on that, go to next, and give this a name. So AppConfig CW or whatever you want here. And we're going to see it's got the right trust relationship. It's got the right policy attached to it. Let's go ahead and create the role now. And yep, it's creating the role. We can close out the IEM tabs because we don't need to come back here, at least for a little while, and then go back to Systems Manager. Oops, sorry about that. Unfortunately, I don't think that this refreshes. Yeah, so you need to refresh the page in order for the IEM role to update. So let's just do that. So we're going back to beta, update environment, and monitors, and let's find our AppConfig CW role here. And now let's set the policy, or the alarm rather, which is the Lambda error alarm. Make sure you click on this add button here, or else it'll automatically skip the monitor. Don't ask me how I know. All right, so now we can click on update environment here. And there you go. So now we have a monitor that is attached to our beta environment. So let's try to do another deployment, and then I'm going to trigger the alarm of our Lambda error alarm during that deployment, and you're going to see this attempt to auto roll back. So let's try that now. So we're going to go to start deployment. And okay, customer ID allow list. We're going to go back to version number 1. And then we're going to make this a slower deployment. So this one is supposed to take around 20 minutes. And yeah, so that's suitable for our use case. So let's start this deployment. And now you'll see this time it's a lot slower. And so, it's only 0% now. So this will dial up. You can track the progress over time. Now let's go and look at our CloudWatch alarm. You can see here the state it's fine. It's an okay state. It's got insufficient data right now. If I refresh this, nothing changed. So let me pull in my terminal here, and I'm just going to run a command really quick that will trigger this alarm into alarm state, and then we are going to watch the results. So I'm just going to change something here. We're going to set this to alarm. And then let's look at this command. So we're saying AWS CloudWatch set alarm state. We're providing the alarm name, Lambda error alarm. We're providing the state value, which is alarm. And then we are providing the state reason, which is for testing purposes. So just pressing enter now. Okay, that succeeded. Let's look at this. Okay, it's in alarm. Let's go back to our deployment. And there you go. So it's already picked it up. It's already trying to roll back, or already did the rollback. And you can see deployment was stopped due to CloudWatch alarm. So that shows you how to use this feature. Like I said, it does require a little bit of extra work, but it is very useful from a safety and deployment perspective. All right, so that is it for showing you how to just set up AppConfig. Now I want to show you how to incorporate AppConfig into a Lambda function using the Lambda layers feature. So let's go and do that now. So we're going to go into, actually going to open up this separate tab here. We don't need this alarm tab anymore. So let's just go into Lambda, and we're going to go there, and we're going to create a brand new function. I'm going to go to the top right here, click on create function. You can call this whatever you want, AppConfig demo is good for me. And we are going to be using Python with this tutorial. So Python 3.9 and permissions. We're just going to use a default role. Then we're going to need to add some additional permissions on top of this role once this is created. So let's go to create function right now. And this should take a moment because it needs to create the IEM role and provision everything, but let's just let this go. All right, so that succeeded eventually. And now what we need to do is we want to add that layer that makes it easy for us to integrate with AppConfig. Now, one thing that I want to point out is that you don't need to use this layer process. If you want, you can use your Lambda and, in your code, you can write the code to call AppConfig's start configuration session and get latest configuration APIs if you wish. However, using the layer makes that process a lot simpler and makes it so that that sidecar process that goes out with your Lambda function deployment automatically retrieves your AppConfig configuration and then makes it available to your Lambda function just through a local call. So that's the approach that we're going to use in this tutorial. So I'm going to click on layers now. And we're going to go to add layer here in the bottom right. You can see there's no layers currently attached here. So we're going to go to add layer. And the neat thing about this is that it's already included as an already provided AWS layer. So leave this as selected, AWS layers. And then under AWS layers for choose, we're going to use the AWS AppConfig extension. As you can see, it's for feature flags, other configuration data for your Lambda functions. We're going to click on this and just select the version. You can go with the most recent one, which is the only one available, and then click on add. So this is going to add that layer so that anytime you deploy your Lambda, this extension is going to go out with it. Now we're not ready to edit the code yet because we need to add some additional IEM policy permissions to our Lambda function so that layer has the right permissions to call the start configuration session API and the get latest configuration API as part of AppConfig. So we're going to go and change that really quick. So let's go to configuration here. And we want to go to permissions. And so this is the role that's attached. As you can see, this only has CloudWatch logs permissions right now. This is going to change after we attach the right permissions to our role. So I'm going to click on this. It opens it up in a new tab. And wow, lots of things going on. All right, so we're going to go to add permissions here. And we're going to say create inline policy. We're going to go to service now and type in AppConfig. And for actions, I believe one is under read and one is under write. So for read, get latest configuration, there it is, get latest configuration. And under write is start configuration session. So we want that one as well. All right, so minimizing those. For resources, I'm gonna again set this to all. Very, very naughty, but that's what I'm gonna be doing to make my life easier. And then go to review policy now. Give this policy a name, so AppConfig, config extension, whatever you want. Create that policy. And I believe this should automatically attach to our role. So yeah, this is still our role for our Lambda function. And now we have that basic execution role. We also have this new role, or new policy rather, that has the two APIs that we need. All right, so we can close this tab now. Going back to our Lambda function, I'm just gonna press F5 to refresh the page. And we should see now we have two actions, as you can see, under AppConfig. And if we click on that, you can see here we have AppConfig, get latest, and start configuration session here. All right, so we are ready to update our code to actually test this thing out. So let's go to the code section, and I am just gonna drop in some code that again, I will make available to you so that you can copy it from Gist or from GitHub or wherever I put it. I'll put that in the description section below. So let me replace this with our code here, and I'll explain to you what is happening. So what you may notice here when you quickly look at this is that we are not using any traditional, Boto 3 Python APIs to communicate with AppConfig. Instead, what we're doing is that we are using the URL lib request library, and we are creating a reference to a URL on the local host on port 2772. And then we are opening or making a request to that port with a specific configuration here. And then we're just returning that back. This is because The side process that is automatically retrieving the configuration file for us is contained within our Lambda container. So we're not making a normal GET request using the Boto3 library. Instead, we're just calling a process that is on a different port, in this case 2772. So we need to replace some things here. So under /applications, then application name, I think mine was called like my app or something like that. And then environment name, that was beta. I know that for sure. And then configuration name, I can't remember what I put there. So let's just go back and go to my app. And okay, so it's customer IDs allow list. Just gonna copy that. And you can also, if you want to retrieve more than one configuration at a time, you can also do that. I'll show you in the documentation where it references that. All right, so we're gonna paste in the new configuration name. So customer IDs -allow list, and then this just makes the call, then this returns. We're gonna deploy this now. And while this is deploying, I just wanna show you the documentation really quick. So I'll also make this link available, or you can just type in like whatever this says, AWS AppConfig integration with Lambda into Google to find this page. This explains to you, how this thing works. It's got your Lambda function, it's got the extension, it's got a local configuration cache that will retrieve the value and store it there by using the SDK, and that thing communicates with AppConfig. What I did want to show you was a couple things. The types of values that you can override through environment variables. So these are the ones here. So you can override a bunch of the different settings. So say you want to use a different port, you don't like 2772, for example, or maybe you already have a side process running on 2772, you can change that value by putting in an environment variable that is this name and with a different value. So maybe 2773, for example. Another important one, at least that I think, is the interval to poll for a new configuration update. So what this means is that every X period of time, the extension is going to call AppConfig for a refreshed version of whatever is there. So this is by default 45 seconds. We can override this to something smaller if we wish, maybe 5 seconds, 10 seconds. But just remember that the AWS AppConfig pricing model, you're charged by the number of times you use that get latest configuration API. So if you have a very high throughput application and you set this to a value very, very low, then you may be charged a lot of money. If you set this to a value that's really, really high, then you suffer from having stale configuration if someone does an update. So you kind of need to pick a balanced value. If you're okay with having stale information in your Lambda for a period, you can set this to a larger value. If you always want the most up-to-date information and you're willing to pay extra, then you can set this to really, really low, like 1 second, 5 seconds, or whatever, and just be confident that you're always going to get that updated value pretty much right away. So I'm going to show you actually how to change this just for education purposes of how you can modify this. So we're going to copy that to our clipboard, by the way. I'm going to go back into our Lambda now, and let's go to configuration, and under environment variables and edit and add environment variable. And we're just going to paste that in. By default, it was 45. Let's set this to 5, for example, and click on save now. And now you can see this value has been set here, so we're good to go. I think we also need to redeploy, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe not. It did say successfully updated the function AppConfig demo, so it may have done a deployment for us. But let's just test everything out to make sure that this is working correctly. So we're going to go to test now. We need to provide a test event just the first time. Put in whatever here, it doesn't matter. We're not reading off the input anyways. Go ahead and click on save now. And we are going to test this out. And if you recall, this should return a object that has customer IDs 1, 2, 3 in it. So let's see if this worked. And there it is. Actually, we're on version 2, which has 1, 2, 3, 4. And so that's how you can use this extension. And as you can see in the logs here, you can see it's doing some additional stuff. So it's registering the extension, it's starting up that extension on port 2772, and then making it available for you. So I hope you enjoyed this demo and learned a lot about how AppConfig works with AWS Lambda. If you enjoyed this video, check out these other ones that I have on AWS. And thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.